Assalamu alaikum. I'm Amanullah. I'm one of the partners at Academos. We are doing a series of podcasts on different topics. Today we have our very special guest with us, Mr. Mudassir Khan from PMRC. He's the Chief Executive Officer at PMRC, and we'll be talking about the housing industry, the real estate industry, and also a very interesting project that we did with PMRC on housing deficit and shortage in Pakistan. Before starting, I would like Mudassir Saab to introduce himself as well. Mudassir Saab, if you can just briefly tell us a bit about yourself and आपकी journey अभी से यहाँ तक की a very brief summary before we start.
Thank you, Manullah. Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be doing this podcast with you. As you said, my name is Mudassir Khan. I am the Managing Director, CEO of PMRC, which is the Pakistan Mortgage Refinance Company. And I joined here almost at the inception of PMRC when it was starting its operation back in 2018. But in terms of my background, I'm an engineer also in terms of education, which I did from the US. I worked in the engineering field for a little while in the US, and then went back to school and did my MBA in finance. Then worked in investment banking for a while, and then investment and corporate banking. Start of my career was in investment banking was with Bear Stearns in New York and in Pakistan, and then from there to Citibank and with the World Bank. I also spent almost about close to 13, 14 years with the World Bank, working in Pakistan and also working across various regions, including South Asia region, Africa region, in the US and Middle East region as well. So, and eventually I decided to leave the bank and come back to the private sector. Spent almost about 8 years with Habib Bank, HBL, in various positions in senior management. Then to National Bank of Pakistan, heading retail commercial banking, including housing, which was part of my portfolio, and also digital banking side. From there, then I moved on to PMRC back in 2018 when it was being set up at that time.
Thank you for that. And if you can tell us a bit about your role at PMRC and how is that different from the like working in the banking sector, like most of your life. So is that very different, or is it more or less?
Yeah. So it is indeed. It is very different. It is because banking, you are actually in a position where you are dealing directly with the customers, right? So you are in retail business, and so yeah, whether it is retail or consumer or commercial or SME, corporate, whatever, you deal with your clients, you deal with customers, and you're lending to them. At PMRC, it's a specialized institution, so it is, and organizations like PMRC are called uh, uh, secondary liquidity facilities because we operate at a wholesale level. So we provide liquidity. The objective is to provide liquidity to the market, including banking industry, banking sector, and all financial institutions which are in the business of lending to housing, doing mortgage financing with retail customers. So that's what we do. So we provide wholesale funding to banks and including conventional banks, Islamic banks. We also went down below to encourage low and middle income housing. So started lending to microfinance banks and microfinance institutions, some NBFCs as well, including newly established housing finance companies in Pakistan.
And so I think for those who don't know, if you can also tell us a bit about PMRC itself. So how is it structured? Is it funded by the government of Pakistan? So a bit like just a very brief summary of
Right.
the model and the structure of PMRC.
So yes, PMRC, as I said, so it was set up around 2000. The concept came in around 2015-16 with the World Bank, the State Bank of Pakistan, and the government of Pakistan. So together, they decided to set up this company, which is housing finance. Secondary liquidity facilities are very prevalent in developed markets. So I don't know if you've heard of in the US, Fannie Mae and
Yeah.
Freddie Mac and Ginnie Mae, Malaysian company. So Pakistan took on the model of Malaysia, which is similar company in Malaysia is called Chagamas.
Right.
It has been in existence for almost maybe 35 years or so. It's a very, very, very large organization in Malaysia. In fact, their debt holdings is bigger than the government of Malaysia, so it's
Wow.
as big. So, and initially, when the World Bank and the government of Pakistan and the State Bank were setting PMRC up, they engaged an ex-CEO of Chagamas who came to Pakistan for 2 years. So he came to Pakistan in 2016. He was involved in the initial setup of PMRC,
Right.
how it should be set up, what it should, what the its roles and objectives should be, its refinancing model and all that was initially done in 2016, 17, and up to 18. So the government then and the state bank then sort of convinced the banks to come in as a shareholder to set up because it's a market company. We lend to the market and it's a market development company. And so in 2018, finally, we received the business commencement certificate from the State Bank of Pakistan. We are a notified DFI. And as shareholders, we got the government of Pakistan, but it is still a minority shareholder, despite
Hmm.
it's one of the largest, but it's still a minority. And we have all major banks in Pakistan, so including National Bank of Pakistan, HBL, UBL, uh, Al Falah, Askari, Allied. All these are shareholders of PMRC.
Right.
Subsequently, we also got IFC, which is a arm of the World Bank, private sector arm. So IFC came in as a shareholder about 3 years ago. So and that was a very positive step for us, IFC coming in, because it was the first such investment in private sector that IFC did in the housing industry, coming in as a shareholder. So that was
Interesting.
a very big positive for us, and it's been there. The funding initially also there was a World Bank credit line which was given to PMRC through the government of Pakistan.
Right.
So World Bank lent to the government, and the government then on lent to PMRC in rupees.
Okay.
And but it was on the same terms, meaning that it was a 30-year credit line with a 5-year grace period,
Right.
and that was one of the major steps for PMRC when we received that funding, that we were able to then lend to market for mortgage finance. As you know, mortgage is a slightly medium to long term
Yeah.
product, and availability of such funding wasn't there in the market. Uh, and the banks were also who were lending in mortgage financing were lending in terms of variable rate funding. So
Right.
the all mortgage products were based on variable rates. And
Interesting.
subsequently, after PMRC's establishment, we were the first one who started then pushed fixed rate funding also. So
Interesting.
we are lending to the banks even now at fixed rates,
Wow.
and then we encourage the banks to lend back, have back to back products for the market, fixed rate products. So they are both fixed rate, and then it's an adjustable rate also, right? So like arms are very common in international
Yeah.
markets, which are adjustable rate mortgages. So we do both. So we do fixed
Variable
rate as
and
well and
fixed.
variable rate as well.
Interesting. And what is the objective of PMRC? So what does it do day to day, and what is the end goal or the purpose of its existence?
So our main purpose of our existence is to actually develop the mortgage market in Pakistan. So the mortgage to GDP ratio in Pakistan was one of the lowest around the world. Also in the region, we are still very low. It increased a few years ago when there was a big push from the government and the
Yeah.
State Bank of Pakistan on mortgage financing. There was a specialized product which was launched by the State Bank. In those 2 years, the mortgage ratio went up a little, but in the last few years, again with higher inflation and interest rates, that has come down. So we are
Yeah.
again now at about 0.28% of
Wow.
GDP, which is very low. Even if you look at the regional markets, even
Wow.
India is close to 12% of GDP. Malaysia, which I gave an example, is around 36% of GDP. If you go towards west, so it keeps rising, right? So it can go up to even higher than 100% of GDP in
I think
certain
I
countries.
would like to explore this
So
further, but I think we're jumping way ahead, and I would like to first understand how and why did you end up into
in
in
this company,
in this company and in housing
in housing,
finance essentially,
so
because I think as far as I understand, housing was your portfolio before as well, but it was part of a
part of
larger
a
portfolio.
larger portfolio. That's
So
right.
why housing specifically? Was that intended, or is it just that the opportunity came up and you took it?
So before I answer this, I think I didn't complete the other one completely. कि PMRC का role क्या है, right? So we are actually As I said, we are a market-based company, so our major objective is to develop the mortgage market. But at the same time, how do we do that? So we do that by, again, providing long-term fixed-rate funding in the market. So that's another objective: providing that liquidity which is necessary, creating an environment of affordable housing in Pakistan, right? So affordability is a big issue in Pakistan. It's not just कि mortgage is less, but again, जो the elites and the prevailing class जो है उसको तो mortgage मिल जाती है because they have the income and they have the resources. It's the people who are below that segment, so the middle, low income particularly, वहाँ पर issue ज़्यादा आता है, and that's where we have a major role to play by bringing in products and type of funding which can create accessibility for them and provide affordability for their mortgages. So that's another role.
Right.
At the same time, another role that we have on the side is to develop the capital markets also, right? So जब हम funding raise करते हैं, अभी तो एक initially we had this credit line from the World Bank through the government of Pakistan. We have also raised a lot of funding from the capital markets, existing funding
Right.
also. But eventually, and maybe we'll talk about it later on as well, that development of the capital market with new asset classes in terms of financial products is another role. So coming in with different types of asset-backed securities, mortgage-backed securities, and short-term, medium-term, fixed-rate, longer-term bonds and sukuks in the market through capital markets, raising that funding. So that's also one of our major roles.
Right. Thank you for that. And the other part.
So
Yes.
so I had been in banking, investment banking, corporate banking, retail banking for a long time. So while housing is, of course, in also I have headed operations as well in HBL. So from back end also, a consumer portfolio, when you are actually managing the consumer all operations across the bank, housing back end also comes to you. So you manage that. So back end say you were aware how things are to be managed. When in National Bank, retail included housing portfolio as well. But at that time, we were actually trying to, so the objective was to consolidate that portfolio rather than expand that portfolio as much. There had been a lot of defaults which had come in the past. So we're trying to do focus on recoveries and consolidation of that portfolio, streamlining that portfolio, and gradually increasing lending in that segment. So it had been, but it was never one of my key sort of interest areas. But development, yes. So development had been in my sort of key ambitions in my life in terms of working towards development sector. That's when where I joined the World Bank
World Bank.
also and working in development sector. And World Bank में ही रहते हुए the first mission that we did on housing sector for Pakistan, where we did discuss a company like this,
Right.
was back in I think around maybe 2000, 1999, 2000 year at that time.
Wow.
That was the first time we did an assessment of the housing sector in Pakistan, and I was part of that mission and team. So we had looked at that, but when this opportunity came up, I felt that this is something, again, a development role in Pakistan, and you can create an institution which will be the first, and you can help develop this market segment which has been neglected and which has not received the desired level of funding.
Interesting.
The low cost and
So it aligned with your skill set, but also your ambition of working in the development sector.
development.
I think one of the challenges that you just mentioned, staying at a conventional bank, was the default rate, and specifically in mortgage, we don't see that number being very high, specifically for the low income target market. Why do you think that is, and how does that challenge sort of become a challenge for PMRC as well? Because indirectly, the consumer is still the same, right?
True. So there are lots of challenges in the housing segment market for mortgage market. So and particularly in Pakistan, our legal framework had not been very conducive in the environment, and recoveries to the court has been a big challenge in Pakistan. And I think that also came out in terms of in your reported survey as well. So the banks were very reluctant to lend, right? And so this segment, again, the recovery from this, when the lending was done, the lending was it was easier to recover because these people do not have, and that's been the experience in terms of globally for microfinance industry as
Yeah.
well, that the lower income people, I mean, they are good borrowers. They are, and including women borrowers have been very uh, good in terms of
Yeah.
recoveries from this segment. So the our objective again was, and when we went to the banks to encourage them to lend, their reluctance was because of the primarily, the legal and the
Yeah.
regulatory environment which was there, which they were facing. So we tried to encourage them through various means, including discounted funding. So we said that, look, if we'll give you funding at a discount to the market, and you pass on that discount to this segment, so their affordability gets better. If the affordability gets better, the credit risk improves. So while this may be a challenge and you feel their higher credit risk, giving them lower rates would encourage them to borrow as well, and encourage you and improve your credit risk. And that's where we started to, and we gave them fixed rate at that time. Then we started back in 2018. The rates were low. It was slightly higher, but then it came down in 2019. 20, the rates were,
Yeah.
very low. The policy rate came down to, 20 was around
Yeah.
7.25%. So these were very low rates for Pakistan. And we were lending to the market. Our lower lending was at around 6%
Wow.
also. And these were at fixed rates for a 3-year, 5-year
Years.
lending, right? And so we asked the banks, and the banks were charging their margin, which varies between bank to bank from 2.5% to 3%.
Right.
So the lending was being done to this segment at 8.5,
Wow.
9, 10% around that segment range. And a lot of the banks, including HPFC, which was the only company in Pakistan which was doing low cost housing at that time. But then other banks came in. So banks like Al Falah, Askari, HPL, Mizan, Bank Islami, Faisal, all JS, all these banks came to lend and borrowed from us. And, we started creating this market.
So what I would like to understand is that, and before going into what the solutions are, I would like to understand what you think is the reason, the core reason, or multiple reasons for people, low income people not opting for mortgages. Is it primarily the high interest rate? Is it also because the regulatory framework is not that conducive to their, I think, circumstances? So what are those reasons, if you can list down some of the core reasons for why we are here and why we are way behind Bangladesh and India, for example?
Yeah. So I think there are, as you said, so it's not just one
Yeah.
reason. There are multiple reasons for it. So, and both from demand side and
Yeah.
supply side, right? So from the customer end, I think it's the for this particular segment. So the microfinance banks or MFIs were actually not lending for mortgage financing at that time, right? So that's when we started. We encouraged and we started lending to MFBs and MFIs to on lend for housing finance. Banks were, but the banks were then the segment of the banks was again uh, basically targeting slightly higher end customers, and also areas where they felt they could easily do recoveries. So they
Right.
would not go into areas where they felt that documentation wasn't up to standard, or they were not. If there were gaps in the documentation, they were not lending, and those they marked those areas as no-go sort of areas for their mortgage financing, right, for lending. So because from a bank's perspective, they want to make
Of course.
recoveries of the loans that they do, and this segment, since it's a longer term loan,
Yeah.
and it gets into default, the recovery becomes a challenge. As I said, legal environment was very challenging. So from customer end, it was accessibility, both in terms of because these banks are not catering to them, and these other smaller institutions were not offering such products. And then it was, of course, the interest rate environment became
Of
challenging.
course.
Inflation is a
Yeah.
challenge. A regular stream or flow of income is a challenge. So all these multiple challenges exist for from the customer end, and from the financial sector end, it's again, as I said, the legal regulatory environment was a challenge. They were not the part of the target market initially. So all these became, when you add them up, it's quite a big.
Of course. Right. So I understand there are multiple reasons why we are where we are, and generally, I think for any private sector firm, it has to be an incentive for them to go into a new area.
That's
So
right.
the onus, I assume, then falls on the government and organizations like PMRC to make that a lucrative opportunity for private sector firms.
Right.
Like, am I right in understanding this?
Oh, absolutely. So, of course, this there are all stakeholders have to be aligned to for this to the market to pick up, and we saw that a few years ago when the State Bank came out with this scheme called the Mera Pakistan Mera Ghar scheme for the banking industry. The government's focus at that time was also on housing.
Yeah,
They were pushing quite a bit. Central Bank came out with this product, which was a subsidized product for end consumers,
yeah,
and the banks were getting their subsidy for market rates from the government of Pakistan or through the State Bank of Pakistan. So that became a very encouraging sort of a factor for the banks to lend to this segment, and so all banks got involved, and the market started to take off, despite all these
yeah.
challenges at the time.
But
So
what is your take on the end achievement of that scheme? So did it do justice to sort of achieving what it was meant to achieve, or do you think that it fell short due to different challenges?
Yes, so in terms of if you look at the numbers, purely in terms of the mortgage numbers, yes, it was very successful because the banks in all like MFBs as well who were involved in this in a period of less than 2 years lent about 130 billion
Wow.
in this scheme under this scheme, which is the MPMG scheme. So as numbers, as a scheme, in terms of reaching the target
Hmm.
market, because the average loan size of this scheme was about 3.5 million. So
Hmm.
which was very, which was that segment lower.
Yeah.
So that scheme had different tiers. It was that tier which was actually the lower tier.
Yeah.
So 3.5 million average was actually you can see that banks were reaching their target
Yeah.
of the low income segment. But if you look at in terms of the cost of it and the
Hmm.
sustainability of this
Hmm.
initiative, that was a big challenge. And the government was giving a huge subsidy to the banks.
Yeah.
And of course, with the government's constraint in terms of budget,
Hmm.
deficit, fiscal deficit, it wasn't something which was sustainable. So the
Of course.
government actually ended up suspending or closing that scheme down. And so beyond that, once this was closed down, of course, the banks then also stopped lending in this
Hmm.
segment. So we are again seeing a decline
A
in the
decline in
of that interest from the banking industry.
so, and I want to understand there's also one core assumption that we are taking before even understanding why the mortgage rates are low is that there is, we are assuming there is a significant demand for housing by the low income housing, low income target group. So
Yes.
how do we establish, and I think that was one of the core things that we targeted in the report as well. But what was your understanding before the report, and how did we assume that there is that demand? Was it mainly based on the population size?
So yeah, so that demand, I mean, an outcome of this scheme also, this MPNG scheme also verified that there is actually that
Mm.
demand that exists. So if the banks are able to lend, so the total outstanding, I think at the time before the scheme started, the total entire mortgage portfolio of Pakistan for the last 70, 75 years, right? That was about 80, 85 billion
Oh.
altogether, right? And in 2 years, the banks were able to lend 130 billion additional, right? So, and that increased to 200 and
Yeah.
whatever, 13 billion or something at that time. So that showed that yes, there is demand.
Mm.
The people were willing to borrow, and but there was this reluctance because of course higher rates,
Mm.
paying their installments in time, then regular. But the interest rate that was used to on lend was so low that that people got encouraged, and
Mm.
they felt that lower interest rate they'll be able to meet the payments,
That
and
makes sense.
and the experience has been such because there have been hardly any defaults under that scheme with all the entire portfolio.
Wow. No, I think the report, and we can, I think, now
Yeah,
naturally come to the
to
report as well.
report as well.
So what was the reason? How did you naturally PMRC came to this conclusion that we need to do this study, and what was your understanding of the study before we started working on it?
Yeah. So, I mean, data is very, very critical in today's market to do anything, right? So, data, as everybody say, data is and big data is going forward is essential for any company. So, we had some data which was available from various reports, but they had been done some years ago. So the data was dated, and we were not sure that if it was as authentic because it came
Mm,
from different variety of sources, but there was no primary research that had been done, and we wanted to get our hands onto actual market, uh,
mm,
whether it exists, how big is that market, and hence we decided that this study would be very important to gauge that what really is the supply and what really is the demand, what is the shortage. We talk about shortages, and
yeah,
I think a number at that time which was floating, and we used to quote that number as well, was around 10 million, 10 to 12 million in terms of
yeah.
housing shortage in Pakistan. But so that's the reason why we went ahead with this project.
Right, and I think so. The housing scheme, the NPMG, was that also based on the assumption that this is the actual deficit or the shortage?
It was,
Right.
yes, it was based on that, and that's why the initial target of that MPMG scheme was to reach up to 5 million customers and
Customer.
create housing units of 5 million housing units in
That makes
Pakistan.
sense. So I think I'll do a short a summary of what the report, what was the methodology, and what did we actually do.
Yeah.
So I think the main objective was, as Mudassir Saab said, that to understand what the real numbers are, what the credible numbers are when it comes to housing shortage, what is the demand, what is the supply, and where do we stand right now? Because I think that is the basis on which the strategy is to be built, of how to increase that mortgage rate, how to sort of fulfill PMRC's role as well,
That's right.
in achieving its objective. So I think together we decided that we'll do primary research, not relying on only the secondary data. And the primary research evolved around multiple variables. So we did around 4,000 consumer surveys from 14 different cities in Pakistan, not just tier one cities, but also tier two and tier three cities, to understand how is the consumer thinking. Is it primarily the interest rate that is hampering this sort of demand, or is it something else? Is there actually demand for housing or not? What constitutes as demand? Is it that you need housing? Is it that you need better housing, or is it that the current housing is not fulfilling your capacity? So I think to truly understanding the consumer's perspective
Right.
in the housing industry in Pakistan. For that, we went to the consumer and just randomly surveyed 4,000 people across 14 cities. The second, and stop me if you want to add anything here, but the second goal was to understand what the experts think as well. So we interviewed 30 industry experts from different areas of expertise, including the government, the private sector, the developers, and the professionals working in this industry for the past 20-25 years, because they have a very solid understanding. Even if they don't have the raw data, they do have a very strong grip on the housing industry. Then we also did a state of the art, I think, at current level, GIS mapping across these 14 cities, where we counted each and every housing unit, and not just the horizontal units, but also understanding how many vertical units are there, through GIS mapping, through understanding the height of buildings and their size and their shadows, from which we can use AI to understand or estimate the heights and the floor size. So to come to a very credible number of the current housing stock in these 14 cities, and then estimating that current housing stock across Pakistan. So I think that is, before the study, I don't think there's any study that was done where we actually counted the housing stock across Pakistan. And then we also used, I think, multiple credible sources to back our claim, so that we
Right.
are not very off from the reality. We use the census data, we use different reports, credible reports published by World Bank, by State Bank, and by other credible, I think, parties. So after we did all of this study, we assumed that it will take 2 months, but it actually took a bit longer than that because of
Yeah.
the, I think, the primary nature of the work. I think the report is relatively lengthier, and we can share that as well. PMRC will be sharing that officially. But the core numbers that I want to discuss today with you is that you mentioned the 10 million figure. I think we understood that 10 million figure is a very blanket number to say. We have to go a bit more granular. So there were two types of sort of numbers that we came up with. One was the shortage, where we matched the needs, demand, and supply, and I think that number came out to be roughly around 2 million. However, if we take into consideration the overcrowded households, the substandard housing, the cost burdened urban households, the number does go up from 10 million to even 20 million. So I want to just understand your reaction to these numbers. What do you think that these numbers say, and what is the implication of these numbers for you?
So yeah, so it's interesting, and the reason I think these were primarily the reasons why we wanted to get this study done, and I think it was very a few numbers were very eye opening for us, which um, and that's what we wanted to achieve. So the claims of those numbers, so it actually did give us a lot of insights into that what the housing actual needs are in Pakistan, what is the real supply, and as you mentioned that the shortage, real shortage in terms of if you look at the need and the supply gap, so that's 2 million roughly, and but if you count the deficit number, which is
Mm,
including all those areas where it's either overcrowded housing or depleted housing, or people living in informal settlements which are really not properly constructed housing, uh, that number then really goes up. And I think the challenge for Pakistan and challenge for us is also that you don't just need to meet the shortage of housing, but you need to cater to the people who are actually now living
mm,
in those substandard housing units, and that's a big challenge. So I think this is something that we initially also started working when you were working with MFIs and MFBs, that incremental housing, which is actually housing renovation, or getting a unit which is whether it's roof is falling or somebody wants to add something, or do a proper bedroom and a kitchen and a washroom, so add that to the housing unit. That type of lending is also required for
mm.
Pakistan, not just new construction or new housing.
Right. So just discussing the supply side first, I think this what and correct me if I'm wrong. This tells us that if we purely let the market do its thing, it will probably just target that 2 million shortage, because those are the people that can potentially afford even in at the low cost level. But if you really want to make an impact, and I think the one of the objectives of you personally and PMRC is to sort of encourage low cost housing and supply. So I think we can't disregard that 15 to 20, even more than 20 million number, because these are people who may not be able to afford, but I think the responsibility or the onus is on the government to supply better housing. After
That's right.
understanding this, what needs to be done, what do you think, and in your opinion, and we'll discuss what other stakeholders also have to comment, but what do you think should be the actionable steps for the government, for PMRC, and for the banking sector primarily?
Yeah. So I mean, various steps can be taken. I think there's a room to do changes both at the policy level, at the regulatory level, and at the institutional level in terms of housing finance side
Yeah.
as well. Um, so, number one, I mean, in terms of when we look at from the government, and the government needs to not only create, as I said, one of a few of the elements which are required, still required, are to have a better legal environment, so
Yeah.
that the banks feel and the institutions feel comfortable to lend. That's a very, very critical factor. While a lot has been done in that area, banks are still reluctant, and they feel that the recoveries would take time. But I think banks also, there's some laxity at the end of the banks also, and they sometimes just take cover of this excuse
Yeah.
and do not want to lend. But if you look at Islamic banks, for
Yeah.
example, Islamic banks have a this is one of the major products because it is asset backed,
Yeah.
and it's one of their major products. So if you look at them, they have been really growing, and they have very large portfolios in mortgage financing, whether it is Mizan Bank or
Yeah.
Faisal Bank or Bank Islami or DIB, which is Dubai Islamic Banks. All these banks have very large, or even the Islamic units of various conventional banks, right? All of them have been lending. So, well, their run rates are much higher. So, of course, they're doing something right while the others are not, or they feel more comfortable to lend in this segment while the
Yeah.
others don't. So, there is this gap as well. But the government definitely needs to look at this segment. It is not just that you need to cater and provide for a housing unit for each.
Mm.
It's a right under the constitution. It's a right of every individual to have a roof over their head, right?
Mm.
So you need to give this, the government as a policy needs to encourage both in terms of this, whether it is the environment, whether it is taxation, whether it is any subsidy that the government wants to offer,
Mm.
and whether it is social housing, right?
Mm.
So when we talk about this type of depleted housing and informal housing segments, this comes under social housing, and a lot of programs have been done not just in our neighbors, like even in India, for example.
Mm.
There's a huge program which has been done even in by the present Modi government has been, and it's a very successful program in terms of social housing. Similar projects exist in even in the Western market. Even if you go to UK or US, you have social housing. So
Mm.
there have people, there are buildings which have been constructed for people who cannot afford or do not have jobs. So they move into the social housing units, and they pay much less rent or don't pay any rent. Then the government picks up the tab.
I'm not
So
sure how relevant this is, but I was reading up on this case study on Singapore as well.
mhm.
Initially, now it's, I think, one of the wealthiest nations in the world. But initially, I think the entire housing was done by the government, and then eventually they transferred that through long-term payments, etc. So something of that sort, perhaps, what I mean to say is that that 20 million figure won't be able to we won't be able to do anything in the next 20, 30 years as well, if the government doesn't incentivize the private sector to somehow fulfill that gap as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So that is a challenge. So the government needs to. I mean, I have one other view on this, right?
Please.
So, and which is also, I think, the perceptions and other things which come out from your survey as well lead to that as well. So the government, while needs to look at this entire segment and correct the policies around it, all around it, right? So, and people have been questioning that the government, revenue shortfall, so the government doesn't tax properly, whether it is the retail segment or whether it is housing or construction industry. So there are various, and agriculture, for example. So there, the government's revenue or the taxation policies are not correct, and they haven't been taxing this properly, right? So while you need to tax the people who are rich and people who can afford and have multiple housing units or do buy land and houses for investment purposes, you need to tax them higher. But people who are buying their first home in life, I mean, you need to give them a tax subsidy,
True.
right? A tax. So that's how you encourage, and you set the tax policy right in terms of taxing the investment part, the rich higher, and tax the people who don't have the affordability or buying their first home lower. And that's how you see tax policies around the world as well, who
Yeah.
have a better housing and mortgage market. You give, I mean, even the mortgage segment, the mortgage payments for at least for the first time home buyers become tax deductible, or there's an incentive in terms of the taxation on interest payments. So the rates are lower
Right.
from the banking industry also for first time home buyers. So multiple policies need to come into play, and I think some of the survey results and expert opinions also point towards this, right?
That is correct.
So this is, I think, we need to work with the government, with the state bank, in terms of coming out with the right both regulatory framework as well as the fiscal policies for the
That makes
government.
sense. But so, do you think, because I think this was a very heated issue recently as well, that the real estate tax rates. And do you think that one of the consequences or one of the byproducts of the scheme, NPMG scheme, was that it sort of increased the housing prices because a lot of investors started pumping in the money? How do you think that, was that a problem, and if so, how can we sort of avoid that by whenever government subsidizes? I think the first to jump in are the people who are again privileged, and they see this as a business opportunity and they sort of take benefit from this. And the result is that the poor can afford even less as compared to before.
So yeah, I mean, even in the past, I mean, the various governments have, so housing had been a focus of all sort of governments, uh, one after the other. But unfortunately, it always gets captured by investors and elites, and so they make buy these properties upfront for investment purposes, and as the prices rise, they want to sell that, right? So the right or the targeted market do not get the right. However, in case of MPMG, we were slightly different because it didn't really, while there were plans to do construction for tier zero by the government on public land, that development started but didn't get completed in time, right? So that didn't happen. But in terms of private sector development, so a lot of the people who actually borrowed in this scheme borrowed for their own construction, or under off plan financing was allowed by the state bank as well. So buildings which were under construction and they were able to afford, they actually went in and bought those through these loans. So it did benefit quite a lot more, at least from what the previous schemes were. But in terms of, as I said, the MPMGs, the type of subsidy in terms of interest rate was so huge that it wasn't sustainable, right? And that's why it was suspended. A sustainable model needs to be put in place. So what we had earlier also recommended to the government, that any subsidy that needs to come in upfront. If you do an upfront subsidy in terms of the housing unit or the housing unit's price, that is actually seen by the customer or the person buying the house or an apartment or a unit, that it is being given as a subsidy, and the government is picking up part of the cost, and they're getting, so government is actually uh, um, uh, has come out with a scheme for them particularly, and they're getting this benefit in terms of this upfront subsidy from the government. So it's very sellable also, right? And people get very encouraged. And what it does is that it allows the government, that if, let's say, the government has room in its fiscal space to do only 1,000 units, or it has fiscal space to do 50,000 units or 100,000 units, it can do that in beginning of the year, right? So it knows that I have that availability in my budget. I can allocate X amount of funds and provide that subsidy. So I can determine that I'll subsidize upfront 10,000 units, and you can stop at that because this is the funds that are available with me. Or even if you get multilaterals come in to partner with you, you can get that type of funding available, and only do construction or do financing for those types of only that number of housing units.
That makes sense.
So it becomes, every year you can come out with a different, this year you can do more, the next year you can do probably less because this is fiscal space, but it is something that you can continue doing every year. So it is a sustainable model, and because there's no interest rate or unknown subsidy which is involved, right? Because of this unknown factor, with the interest rates skyrocketing and going 3 times what it was 2 years ago, the government was left with nothing but to suspend, because they couldn't afford that level of subsidy being given out to the banks. So all these models. So if you in you and we are very willing to work with the government and the state bank and other stakeholders, sit down and chart out this type of a model, which is then sustainable and which will be an ongoing. So changes in policies, changes in regulation, changes in taxation, and all these things really impact the market, whether it is a business segment
Of course.
or this type of scheme. So people get confused that there is a policy today, 2 years down the road it has been taken away. So you're left high-handed and you can't do anything, and then you see defaults come in and you see businesses going down or growth going down.
So, uh, just to sort of one of the things that I take out from your conversation is that um, if the government does a huge claim, then it has to back that claim, and then the sort of that is one of the reasons why the policy becomes unsustainable.
That's right.
So, can we then say that the more apolitical the scheme or the policy is, the better, because then there will be no pressure in the political sense, and then we do what we can, what the
Yeah.
government does what we can, but at least it will be doing something sustainably. Is that fair to assume?
Oh yes, absolutely. So the government sets the policy,
Yeah,
sets the policy up front, and that policy is there. So the government doesn't, get involved in the nitty-gritties. It
yeah,
lets the central bank or and the organizations which are market-based, like
yeah,
the PMRC. Housing, in any case, becomes it's a provincial subject. So
of
let
course.
the provinces get
Yeah.
involved. There's a lot more that needs to be done in terms of the provincial level also,
Mm,
right? We have been talking about, and I think came out from your survey as well, in terms of documentation side, right?
mm,
So you need to have the land records and the document, being digitized and
yeah,
bringing them online, so that it's easier for the institutions who are lending to look at the documentation which exists for that particular property, and having that available online, doing title searches and doing all that.
yeah.
So it's easier to lend. It makes it convenient. Environment is feasible, so people feel comfortable to lend also,
That
and
makes
that brings the
sense.
cost down
Yeah,
also, right? And sorry, one or two
yeah.
other things that need to be done on the part of the regulations from the provinces and the government is also in terms of documentation standardization. So
Mm,
you need to standardize that
mm,
document across various provinces, because right now each province has it, and each, not just a
mm,
province, each development authority has its own requirements. Different type of sets of documents are required. You go from DHA to in Karachi, from to KDA to Malay Development Authority to wherever, and they have different document requirements. So, and
right.
this is across the country,
True.
and it just adds up to the cost. And it not just adds up to the cost, it also makes financial institutions costs go up as well, because they feel that everywhere they'll have to go and have different verification process for that document, set of documents.
So I think this is very clear that the role of government is crucial here. However, and this is probably the last point in the supply side, and then I want to shift to the demand side as well. But however, I think you have a fair understanding of the microfinance industry as well. And one of the, I think, key successes of the industry is that they sort of created a blue ocean strategy where others were not even looking for, and without much help from different governments across the globe, they are able to create that market that was sort of non-existent by sort of the regulatory framework is, I think, relatively different. I'm not an expert here, but from what I understand, and we did a project with the microfinance bank, is that the process of getting a loan is very different from a conventional bank. So, do you think microfinance has been successful in Pakistan? And if so, what can the housing industry learn from that microfinance model? So, if you think there's anything else that the government has potential to do, I would like you to talk a bit about that, and then I would like you to answer the microfinance industry as well, your
Yeah.
understanding of it.
So yeah, so the government, as so the multiple, apart from all these, so sustainable model also would involve. I think one other thing which is important is this long-term funding challenge, right?
Mm,
So the Pakistan capital markets have been very short-term in nature,
mm,
and again, real estate or low-cost housing are not very conducive to investors who are out there who are looking for a return and going to
mm,
the capital market. So that remains a challenge. So the government can play a major role, because there are not just the government itself, because it has as a stakeholder to provide housing for low cost and for social sectors is important. But then multilateral, a lot of donors, agencies
mm,
are very keen in this segment for low cost housing, and they are willing to come and support. I mean, we have a lot of donors and country and multilateral support coming in for when we had 2 years ago, when we had these floods.
mm,
Almost 2 million houses
yeah.
units got destroyed just in Sindh, and then also in Punjab, southern Punjab, and Balochistan and KP. So a lot of donors and governments, and they came in with grant funding and with subsidized lending, So those types of subsidized lending and long-term
Mm.
lines are very critical for the housing market, particularly for this segment of the market.
And this could become an opportunity. This crisis can become an opportunity to sort of get that funding and actually get it to the people who need it.
Correct. And the government is always, for example, if the type of lending comes in, the government is always looking to get dollars, right?
Yeah.
So it is a foreign exchange. So for us,
Mm.
our there's a challenge in terms of our balance of payments as well,
Mm.
right? We are a import country.
Yeah.
We import, our largest import, of course, being uh, uh, oil and oil products. Um, and there's always been a challenge to we struggle with IMF and with
Mm.
bilateral funding, which is also very expensive.
Yeah.
So with multilateral coming in social sectors such as
Mm.
whether it is poverty or health or even low cost housing, there you are able to access that funding, which
Mm.
is subsidized and very long term. So it actually benefits the government,
Yeah.
not just in providing that access of long-term funding, but also getting the dollars and supporting the sector which is in need for government support.
Sort of like
So
there are double benefits
yeah.
associated with it. Makes sense. So any comments on the
So yeah.
microfinance industry?
So
Yeah.
microfinance industry has really been very successful and
Yeah.
has picked up in Pakistan in the
Okay.
last nearly about 20 to 25 years or 30 years. So but it is always a challenge for that industry because it was quite heavily dependent on, again,
Mm.
donor funds and multilateral funds coming in to support that segment. And it is something where they wanted to target these people who are primarily in the informal segment and who do not have the affordability or any income levels to go to a formal financial
Yeah.
institution to go and borrow. So that's where the microfinance institutions came in and started supporting them both socially in terms of education and otherwise also in terms of providing credit at very for short-term credits for productive use to start a small business, micro business, whatever. And that has been successful. The only thing is that with various downturns in the country, it's always
Mm.
economic environments are cyclical. Sometimes locust comes and destroys the agriculture crop, and
Mm.
so all the lending that you've done in that segment will then get affected.
Mm.
So they have suffered from variety, and if the interest rates go up in the
Yeah.
market significantly, then you'll see defaults coming in. So those types of economic and other challenges, environmental challenges, exist for the microfinance sector. So again, the advantage and even for housing, the important thing is for the government and to support through variety of
Mm.
guarantee type of products,
Yeah.
which can or insurance type of products, which can help that segment, and also for the housing segment for that lower income segment to continue borrowing and not be affected by such higher interest rate environment or such other environmental factors.
That makes sense. And so, do you think that? And I want to understand this as a layman. That how does microfinance sort of does like avoid that hassle of paperwork of the regulatory framework? How does that work? Because I think that is something that came in as a huge challenge in the demand side as well. Because that's a huge deterrent that I have to go through that paperwork and the regulatory framework. So how has sort of microfinance hacked that model?
Yeah. So microfinance model essentially, it works very differently than the form.
Yeah.
So they work. They have to. It works when you actually are very close to the customer.
Yeah.
When you know, there's a KYC, right? Know your customer
Mm.
policies in the banking industry, but it's actually how well you know your customer.
Mm.
And these microfinance institutions operate in communities in
Mm.
rural or in urban segments, and they have field officers on ground,
Yeah.
feet on the ground, who actually are regularly in touch with their customers.
Mm.
And and even if the defaults come in, they come in because if they lose that contact with that
Mm.
customer, you would see that
True.
default come in. So that model ensures that while and if they also work with the customer, that if the customer is in a situation where something happened, an accident happens, or there's a marriage, or there's a requirement for something else which is an emergent sort of a requirement, then they cater to that as well, right? So they can give them a little bit of flexibility in terms of the repayment, so the customer actually doesn't, because they understand the customer, they know that there's this specific need which has arisen, and the customer needs that funding right now and will not be able to meet either the full payment, or they can make partial payment, or they can actually give them flexibility that okay, you have this another month to come and pay. So so that type of element. So they are actually, so the paperwork is very simple because it is an application. They know the customer, so there's no real collateral sort of documents, and
Exactly.
they're not lending against all those property documents or whatever. So they don't actually have those documentation available.
So
So
what I want
it
to
makes it
come
very easy.
to is that perhaps what needs to be done is sort of a rethinking of how the affordable housing becomes as attractive to the banking sector, because as you said, right now they're not very excited about this sector, and instead of just government doing its role, maybe the private sector can also think creatively and come up with models where housing of
Yeah,
low cost or low affordable housing becomes attractive to the private sector banks as well.
yeah,
I think one of the findings from anecdotes from research that we did in microfinance was that they have this different proxies to understand whether a person will default or not. So, for example, even the gender also tells you a lot about whether, so women are relatively less
risky.
chances of defaulting.
Right.
If the education is high, then the default rate goes down. If the person is investing in a business, then the default rate goes down. But if they're investing in perhaps an expense, then they just eat up that. So maybe like, do you think that uh, there's a lack of creativity or incentive to be creative in the banking sector, where they can perhaps, even without government support, come up with different products that caters to affordable housing?
That is indeed, so innovation is lacking.
Hmm.
So that incentive to actually come out with variety of products and taking risks in this sector, in the financial industry, formal banking industry lacks is lacking. So I mean, we worked. I mean, for example, as I mentioned, government to support into the guarantee, or insurance. So we, with the government, we actually had a guarantee product also. So we were
Right.
guaranteeing for low cost housing. We provided a guarantee through this World Bank funding which had come in, 40% credit loss guarantee for low cost housing, right? So that really encouraged the banks, because they saw that 40% of that risk is now mitigated. So
Yeah.
they'll come, if there's a default, will be picked up by this guarantee coverage. And so that helped also as part of the MPMG, while the banks were willing to lend with the subsidy, but they were still reluctant because they felt that if there is a default, the recovery would not be possible. And
Yeah.
with this guarantee, they had that comfort to go ahead and lend, right?
True.
So similar products like insurance. So we work with the insurance industry,
Yeah.
and we got all the insurance players together as an industry, and we said, look, for low income, particularly low income segment, that if there could be multiple, these people, people have multiple issues in life.
Of course.
Life is not always, a smooth ride, right? So somebody has an accident, for
Yeah.
example, right, and is unable to go to work, or the business that the person runs, maybe is driving a cab or a rickshaw, or whatever, as a tire shop or something. But because of that accident, the income gets disrupted, right? So we worked with the insurance industry to come out with a product that, a temporary income replacement. So something like that happens, then the insurance, if there's insurance coverage, people know that there is a genuine case. The person has had an accident. He'll be back on his feet in 2 3 months or 4 months. So about 4 month period, that insurance product would kick in
Interesting.
and meet those installments. And that product was there for available, and it was a very, wasn't very high in terms of its cost premium as well, and it provided insurance coverage for such incidents to happen twice during the life of the mortgage. So if the
Interesting.
mortgage is, let's say, for 15 years or 20 years, that something like that can happen, that income disruption can happen twice in that period, so insurance would,
Interesting.
coverage would be available. So that product is, we worked with the insurance industry to come out with that product. We sold it to, not sold it, but we actually marketed it, or got the central bank to also, they approved, SECP approved, the other regulator, and also marketed and sent it to all the members of the Pakistan Banking Association through that. So all banks were given that information. But unfortunately, the premium that they wanted, that if there is a uh, real estate development, so
Mm.
all customers of the real estate development, if there are like 200 units being built up, that all 200, the bank will get that insurance, take out that insurance for all 200 people, and not just for few or
Mm.
10, or can't be selective.
Right. I think within the supply side factors, we have discussed banking, the role of government, the role of institutions like PMRC. But I think there's also one key player that we haven't discussed, which is the developers in Pakistan.
Yeah.
The popular opinion is that they focus primarily on the elite housing, and the projects are mostly targeted towards that. But I would like to understand what you think is their context, what are their challenges, and how can they play a role in affordable housing in Pakistan?
Yeah. So number of challenges again in the developer, and we also worked with the associations of various developers like Abad
Yeah.
in Karachi and in Punjab as well. And we worked with the central bank also in terms of encouraging and making changes in regulations to encourage the banks to lend to the developers. Um, but the challenges, I think their challenges are far apart from financing, which is another
Mm.
challenge for the banking industry. But there has been a challenge also in terms of obtaining permissions and
Mm.
permits, and there's a huge cost involved, right?
Mm.
So I think for even one development, I think somebody was quoting a number of, I think, 20 plus sort of permissions, 17 to
Oh.
20 type of permissions which are required. And at one point in time, I think we were discussing it with the developers that, and we found out that just in Karachi alone, there were almost 300 plus developments which were pending permissions, or projects which were pending permissions for initiation of the project. So those types of, not just challenge, because once the project is delayed, there's a
Mm.
huge cost associated to the developer, right? Because
Mm.
the longer the project gets delayed, the cost keeps rising, right? The construction cost in the last few years
Mm.
alone has gone up almost by nearly 50%, 40 to
Oh.
50% cost has gone up, whether it is cement or steel, or other materials. A bag of cement, maybe, which was somewhere around six, 700, 800 a few years ago, or just 2 years ago, is now probably in the range of 12, 1300, or even 1400
Mm.
now, right? So the costs have gone up very, very significantly. So a delay in project causes that, and with the price escalation, the project gets unfeasible.
Mm.
So the important thing is that, and what we try to do also, from at least on the financing point of view, is to give the bank and the developer, through the banking industry, funding the developer with fixed
Mm.
rate funding, and giving those funds upfront to the bank. So
Mm.
having that funding available and secured for the developer, that the developer knows that this funding is available with me at this particular cost for the next 3 years while I do my construction. So that risk of increase in interest rates,
Mm.
or non-availability of funding, that risk is taken out. Then the only the remaining is the escalation in terms of the construction material and all that. But that's also a big challenge. So if the project gets completed in time,
Yeah.
then those costs can be managed, because a lot of the developers want, if the funding gets available,
Mm.
that they would like to procure all those things quite
And
upfront,
yeah,
right? So that reduces and mitigates that risk as well.
that makes sense.
So, but other side, there's another side also to it, right? The other side is that the developers, as you said, do not really want to cater to this particular segment. They
Mm.
feel that the cost, the cost of land or the cost of construction in Pakistan has gone up very significantly, and with that going up, their affordability of this segment will not be there,
Mm.
and they cannot construct units which are at that level, so that can be afforded by these people. So that's why this whole, as I mentioned earlier,
Mm.
that this whole partnering with the stakeholders, including the government of Pakistan, to come in and ensuring that, that upfront subsidy if that becomes available. Then you encourage this segment to come and buy, and that price of those units will become affordable for
So,
them. So
right. So, you were talking about the limitations for the real estate developers.
right. So the other side which I was
Yeah.
talking about was that so the developers can have because of that non-targeting by the developer, and so there's sometimes oversupply, right? So and the units remain unsold because the people who want to buy cannot afford it, and people who are not interested, they can afford but are not interested. So they need to target that, and then maybe as we discussed earlier with the government and under the MPNG scheme as well, to have this cost subsidy by the developer.
Interesting.
So building commercial area, allowing them to build commercial units as well, and having other higher end as well, and then cross subsidizing for having at least 10 to 20% for the slower segment units, which are then cross subsidized, and so they become affordable.
That's very interesting, I
So
think.
yeah,
And then I think most of the developers are also probably when we are saying that there should be more creative products. The goal shouldn't be the onus shouldn't be on banking sector only. I think the
yeah,
real estate developers can work with the banking sector to come up with these products as well. I like
absolutely.
one of the things that came out of the survey is that this perception of the consumer, and now we are moving towards the demand side as well, that it is very difficult to get mortgage funding. So that perception is partly because there are a lot of stakeholders. First, you have to agree with the real estate developer that okay, I'll get this on installments. Then you have to go and convince the bank, and then you have to go and fulfill the government's. So if they are probably like there's a standardized structure where the private and public sector work together,
Right.
at least that part of the limitation or the hesitation from the consumer's part, that can be rectified, right? Um,
Correct.
so your comment on the consumer's side as well. I want to understand what, and I'll talk about the survey results. I think only 6% said that they had ever done any mortgage in their lives, and out of those 6%, 50 more than 50% said that they did it only because it was Islamic financing. So what do you think are the main limitations in their mind, the consumer's mind, other than the affordability and the interest rates, which
Yeah.
hopefully will go down?
So yeah, so apart from affordability, interest rates, so then the other part is also the reluctance in terms of or perception that they will not be able to meet the documentation requirement. The application, there are a number of forms to be filled in by the bank. So under MPMG, one of the other things was done was there will be a single page sort of an application form. So the information that is required, you just get it in one form, and you do your assessment based on that, and you do various other uh, 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 sort of use surrogates to do your credit checks and so on and so forth, right? And that gets very important. So for the consumer, so this documentation and the plethora of documents, because they are unable, a lot of them are not as literate and they're not able to understand the forms, and having these forms in different languages, in even in Urdu or in Sindhi or in Punjabi would make it easier. And that side. Then the other part was the uh, 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 reluctance to also go into the formal financial institutions. They feel that they are not really they don't fit in, or they get sort of scared to actually walk into a bank or and they would not know what to do, where to go. So that type of reluctance because of that is also a big plays a big role. And lastly, then this conventional versus Islamic is a big element. So preference, as I think survey came out also, that maybe 60 plus
Yeah.
percent preferred to have Islamic finance, and because of the interest element in it. And we also saw that our funding, we started with a lot of doing banking with the commercial banks, conventional financing, but now our financing has also moved almost 60% Islamic and
Wow.
40% is conventional. So that is indicating that where the market is moving towards. And
More.
you also have this decision of the Supreme Court, where the entire industry has to move towards to Islamic by end of 2025. So there were 5 years given, although it is very an uphill task to get the entire industry shifted by that time frame. but nonetheless, a lot of banks are making a lot of effort to
Mm.
actually, and so have we. I mean, in terms of our products, so every product that we have, which is for conventional, we also have it for Islamic, be it refinancing,
Mm.
guarantee, whatever it is. So we have a Islamic version, and so for us, it's simpler. That it would depend on the bank's preference. If the bank just wants Islamic, so we just do Islamic, and that's it.
That
So
makes sense.
uh,
So indirectly, the consumer sort of directs the banks, and the banks directs you and
yeah.
your company. So I think one of the things that came out of the survey was that consumers are also just scared of losing money if they go with the bank. So there's this perception that the banks are out there to get you instead of using banks to get what you want. In their mind, at least at some level, they're afraid that they will be used by the banks. So do you think that sort of an awareness model or awareness campaign where you educate the consumers of the benefits of mortgage as well, do you think that could be beneficial as well?
Oh, very, very bad. I think it's one of education in every sort of
True.
industry, for particularly finance, is very, very critical. So consumer needs to understand what is available, how is it
Mm.
available, how does it affect them, what are the options available. So those elements are not there, which are which
Mm.
are not written down or publicly available. So people have that reluctance because of that. And I think we have tried to educate. I mean, we have done a lot of it. We do a lot of trainings and seminars and other things for our financial borrowers, as well as the microfinance industry as well. I think, and we encourage them to actually go and train their
Mm.
customers. So it gets challenging at times, because the consumer is a huge base
Mm.
for having such seminars. But public information in terms of flyers, or flyers having in a variety of languages, availability to them, having product knowledge, disseminating them through either media campaigns
Mm.
and papers, or radio is a cheaper, a medium where a lot of people listen to it, and particularly in semi-urban or rural areas. So these types of call centers now, which have
Yeah.
become very common, all right. So the industry also, and under MBMG also, the industry got together and set
Mm.
up a call center for this scheme in different languages. So people would call in, and they would answer all their
Mm.
queries, in terms of the product, what is available to them and not.
I think we've
not.
seen that in finance, in the financial sector, there are a lot of startups coming in targeting specific products, and
Yeah.
mostly, I think we've seen some in agriculture, we've seen in other domains as well. Um, Probably we're going to see more real estate or housing startups as well. Is that something that potentially an organization like PMRC can explore as well in order to sort of fulfill its own objectives?
Oh, absolutely. So we actually did work a lot with SECP as well
Hmm.
earlier, in terms of the regulatory framework, and with that changes in the regulatory framework, then private sector got encouraged, and I think we are
Hmm.
now have at least four new HFCs, housing finance companies, which came into
Wow.
existence. But again, I think while they are there, unfortunately, the time when they got started, the interest rates started to going
Yeah.
up, inflation kicked in, and all that. So they've been feeling
The heat. Yeah.
a challenging environment. But we have lent to, at least we have two of them, and so that again, below market rate, so the affordability is better, and so on. So, and
I think we were like, probably the direct direction or the trajectory was positive until we had this economic crisis kick in. One
that's
last
true.
comment on the vertical versus horizontal housing. I think one of the key things that came out of the survey was that while vertical becomes more affordable for everyone, the consumer's inclination for vertical housing is still not there
Not
yet.
there.
It is in Karachi because of I think we have Karachi was vertical way back, but in other cities, both I think regulatory framework and the consumer perception don't allow vertical to flourish. What is your opinion on that?
Yeah. So the perception is there very much so, and but again, it's a matter of having the units available. So if
Mm.
you now go, I mean, even if you go to, for example, cities like Islamabad, right?
Mm.
you see a lot of verticals coming up. I mean, you go from the airport towards the main city, and you see developments happening on both sides of the highway, right?
True.
And all these verticals coming up, and inside, even in Islamabad, you see the blue area, and you see all these verticals from one end to the other. So the concept is now kicking in because of the cost. So because the
Hmm.
cost of land has gone up
Hmm.
extensively, and the cost of construction has gone up significantly. So building a horizontal unit is very, very expensive.
Hmm.
Even in the areas where the government, or even like DHAs, where they have allocated certain part of DHA, where you have land cutting for only even 100 yards,
Hmm.
or 300 200 yards and 300 yards. Even those land prices have gone up,
Hmm.
have become so high that they are not even affordable by even middle income families.
True.
So what to talk of low income. So this vertical makes a lot of sense
Hmm.
in terms of um, making advantage of the same piece of land, and rather than constructing maybe 5 or 10 units, you're constructing 100 units or whatever, right? So it brings the cost down, it improves the affordability, and it gives you an environment of a full community sort of an environment.
Hmm.
And now you would see, I think, what is also important for these developers to see that they can provide that community environment.
Hmm.
So by building social sort
Yeah.
of activities within
True.
that complex, so that people have an integrated facility is available in the same housing project.
So I think now it is a necessity to go vertical for everyone. But the perception of mainly people living in Punjab, वो जो there's a phrase कि घर सर और ज़मीन अपनी
Happening
छत और ज़मीन अपनी होनी चाहिए. तो वो I think that probably will evolve over
over
time
time.
when it becomes way more lucrative and there's monetary incentive to go vertical.
Yeah.
But there's this trend that we see that the vertical housing is being bought by investors and then being sublet as investments to middle class or low income segments. So even if you're middle income or low income, you'd rather buy a land somewhere and then live maybe in a rental vertical space because you don't want to buy or invest in a vertical space for the long term or for your own self. I think that probably will also evolve. What do you?
I That will definitely evolve. So I think, I mean, so the variety of products also need to come in. So I mean,
Hmm.
for example, we have been discussing with the banks in terms of a rent to own type of models, right?
Hmm.
So people have that flexibility that today, and because there's you need to have rental available as well. It's
True.
not just owning land
Exactly.
or an apartment. So because people move for reasons of for job, for
Hmm.
employment, right? So if you're moving, then if you own a place and you can't, I mean, then it becomes, and you have a mortgage, then it becomes very difficult to get out
True.
of that mortgage and sell. And so you might want to rent, and then if you feel that this is something where you're there for long term, then you can
Hmm.
always, if you have the option, then you can always buy that, convert that into a mortgage. So these types of products which are flexible, which cater to the needs of the market, are important to develop and to launch in the market. So, and we have been working with the banks, a lot of the banks. One other product, I mean, we have been looking at, green housing, for
Hmm.
example, trying to encourage solar,
Hmm.
and one of our products offers solar facilities in a housing unit, and
No.
houses which are both climate friendly and resilient as well. Post floods also that happened in
Hmm.
Sindh and in Punjab. So Sindh has progressed quite a bit in terms of
Yeah.
the destruction that happened. A lot of these construction in these areas have happened, and continue to happen, which are both specifically climate resilient. And so apart from climate resilience and green, you also have a product where I think this also came out of the survey, that people felt that they did not have sufficient funding
Hmm.
for even making the down payment. So
Yeah.
what do they do? So we have recently we are working on a product which will come to the market very soon, is to provide a guarantee for that down payment for the customer. So up to a level of 15%.
Wow.
So our guarantee will be given to the institution against that down payment, and the bank can extend financing based on our guarantee, which is full. So even
Very
if
nice.
uh, which is called the LTV ratio, the loan to value ratio, right? So they can extend that financing.
Very nice. I think
That helps.
in summary, the challenges are huge, but it's not like they're not. We don't have possible solutions for these challenges, and hopefully we'll see some of these solutions kicking in. Just closing remarks on what do you think is the current and future of the housing market in Pakistan with the current economic turmoil? Do you think are you hopeful for the next couple of years? And what is your vision that what will be the PMRC's role in these upcoming years in the housing market in Pakistan?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think hope is the key word. So we are all very hopeful that yes, the market will pick up, and I think we have started to see that the interest rates are coming
Yeah.
down. Inflation has come under control,
Mm.
and we expect the interest rates to further decline during this year and in the coming few years. So that will definitely be very very helpful for particularly the housing market,
Yeah.
right? So since it's a longer term product and the installments depend a huge
Mm.
lot on the interest rates. So we do expect and that the market would pick up, and mortgage market, which has seen a bit of a decline
Mm.
in the last year or two, to pick up again and the mortgage market to grow. The banks have definitely, and the financial institutions have had the experience now. And if the rates come down, I think, and with a lot of new products that we have been
Mm.
discussing and trying to encourage the market to launch with those types of products which cater to the customer needs, and we are very hopeful that the market would definitely pick up. And I particularly have, I do see that PMRC would be a key player in this. We want PMRC to, we are now, Alhamdulillah, in a very short span of time, one of the leading DFIs in Pakistan.
Mm.
And with a balance sheet footing of about 60 billion, we started about 5 years ago with zero. So
Wow.
we are now reached that, and we do see playing a continuous role in development of this market
Mm.
and policy framework, development of that policy framework with the government, the regulatory framework with the regulators, both the State Bank and the SECP, and with all the key stakeholders in terms of developers, the banks, the MFIs, MFBs, housing finance companies, and everyone. Since we are a market company, and I see that role increasing with time,
Mm.
and we taking a very lead role in development and within in the center point of focal point of this the market going forward, and hopefully also seeing that market take off with the interest rates coming down,
Yeah.
so that it is at the end of the day, it is for the consumer, people who want to have a home, to be able to afford that. So
True.
that's been our main concern, and I think we're very hopeful that that will happen soon, inshallah.
Inshallah. I think as a market research company, we have seen that we get a very good proxy of what the general sentiment is, and we do see that this hope is now arising everywhere, not just in private sector, in public sector, in consumers. So yes, I think as long as there's nothing like there's no big blunder on anyone's part, hopefully gradually we will see growth in all of these sectors.
Inshallah.
Thank you so much for taking out time for this, and hopefully we'll be doing more of these with PMRC and with other housing players to get a strong understanding of what we can do, and then maybe generate a dialogue that can lead to something positive in the industry as well.
Thank you. And just one last, I think I would like to thank you, Oman, Manal, and your entire team, your company, for doing such great work. And I think it's particularly the outcomes that have come out of this. The real gist of actually getting the customers, feeling their the beat in terms of the pulse, what
Mm.
is going on, and what their perceptions are, and how they see the market, and the use of technology that you have done in terms
Mm.
of use of AI and GIS, which was very, very enlightening for us. I mean, seeing the entire images of the land across Pakistan, what is available there for
Mm.
construction, for housing, and what's not, and it's very enlightening. And I am thankful to you and your team for making that effort. And inshallah, we'll see this work help in all areas in terms of
Inshallah.
the policy as well.
Thank you so much, Mudassir.